Rome, 81 AD. The air beneath the Colosseum is thick, a heavy blanket of dust, sweat, and despair. Down here, in the labyrinthine tunnels known as the hypogeum, sunlight is a myth, a forgotten memory from a life before chains. But tonight, something else flickers in the gloom, a spark more potent than any torchlight. A whisper. It travels from cell to cell, a ghost on the stale air. Rebellion, the word is a dangerous phantom, tasted on the tongues of men who have nothing left but their own desperate courage. No one knows who spoke it first. Was it Cassius, the hulking Gaul whose hammer fists could shatter shields? Or perhaps Lyra, the Thracian woman whose quiet eyes held a storm of defiance? Her job to mend the leather straps of the very men sent to die. It doesn't matter. The seed is planted. Every captive feels it, a strange current humming through the stone floors. The gladiators, gods in the arena, and chattel in their cells, are restless. They sharpen their blades not just for the morning spectacle, but with a new, unspoken purpose. The clang of metal on whetstone sounds different tonight, less like preparation for a performance, more like the tuning of an instrument of vengeance. Among them is Marcus, a Numidian captured in a desert skirmish. He was a freeman, a leader of his tribe, now reduced to a number, a piece of property. He has fought and won in the arena for 2 years, earning the grudging respect of the crowds and the wary eye of his lanista, Batidas. Marcus has seen too many friends, too many good men, dragged from these tunnels, their bodies broken for the entertainment of the masses. He listens to the whispers, his heart a war drum in his chest. For 2 years, survival was his only goal. But the whispers are changing that. Survival is no longer enough. Freedom is the only prize worth fighting for now. His closest confidant is Valerius, a Roman legionary disgraced and sold into slavery for alleged cowardice. Valerius knows the Roman way of war, their tactics, their formations. He's seen the machine from the inside, and he knows its weaknesses. He's been quiet, biding his time, his shame a constant fire in his gut. When Marcus approaches him in the flickering lamplight, the question hangs unspoken between them. It's not if, but when. Valerius looks around the cramped, filthy space. He sees the faces of men from every corner of the empire. Gauls, Britons, Dacians, Jews, they are a fractured, motley crew, united only by their chains. They expect us to hate each other, Valerius murmurs, his voice raspy. That's how they control us. In the arena, we are enemies. Down here, we must be brothers. The plan begins to form, a fragile blueprint of hope drawn in the dirt. It's insane, suicidal even. They are a few hundred slaves against the might of the Roman Empire in the very heart of its power. But what is the alternative? A certain death in the sands above, cheered on by a faceless mob. Here, in the darkness, there is a chance, however slim, to die as men, fighting for a cause greater than mere survival. The key is the Great Gate, the Porta Triumphalis through which the victorious gladiators exit. It is their only path to the city, to the streets, to a slim chance of escape. But it is always heavily guarded. Lyra, moving through the tunnels with her mending kit, becomes their eyes and ears. She notes the guard rotations, the patterns of the sentries, the way the keys jangle on the belt of the chief warden, a brutish man named Severus who takes pleasure in his authority. She reports her findings in hushed tones, her needle and thread becoming instruments of espionage. Cassius, the giant Gaul, is tasked with the most direct role. His cell is closest to the armory, where the real weapons, not the blunted training swords, are kept under lock and key. His job will be to create a diversion, a brawl so convincing that it draws the guards away from their posts just for a moment. A moment is all they will need. The day of the games arrives. It is the inauguration festival for the new emperor, Domitian, a grand spectacle designed to win the favor of the people. The Colosseum is roaring, a beast of 80,000 voices baying for blood. Down below, the tension is a physical thing, a knot in the stomach of every conspirator. Marcus claps a hand on Valerius's shoulder. "For freedom," he says, his voice steady. "For freedom," Valerius echoes, his eyes alight with a fire that has long been dormant. As the first group of gladiators is herded towards the lifts that will carry them to the arena floor, the plan is set in motion. Cassius roars, a primal sound of fury, and throws a punch at a fellow gladiator, a trusted ally in the plot. The fight erupts. It's brutal, chaotic, and utterly convincing. As predicted, guards rush towards the commotion, their attention diverted. Severus, the warden, bellows orders, his face red with anger. In that precious window of chaos, Lyra slips a small, sharp piece of bone she had sharpened for weeks into the lock of the armory. It's a crude tool, but she has practiced on lesser locks for a month. A click. The door swings open. Valerius and a small, hand-picked group of fighters pour inside. They arm themselves not with the ornate helmets and shields for show, but with the sharpest gladius swords and the heaviest spears. Meanwhile, Marcus stands before the lift, his moment of truth. He is scheduled to fight in the Primus Palis, the highest-ranking bout. The crowd chants his name. He is their hero, their savage champion. They have no idea he is about to become their greatest fear. As he steps onto the wooden platform, he looks back at the fighters emerging from the armory. He gives a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The lift groans upwards, carrying him into the blinding sunlight and the deafening roar of the Colosseum. He steps onto the hot sand, his opponent across the arena, waiting. But Marcus isn't looking at him. He is looking at the emperor's box, at the rows of senators, at the faces of his captors. Back below, the real battle begins. Valerius leads the charge. His legionary training takes over. "Form a shield wall," he bellows. The newly armed gladiators, men used to fighting for themselves, now fight as one. They slam into the unprepared guards, a wave of steel and fury. The tunnels, once their prison, become their battlefield. The narrow corridors that had confined them now work to their advantage, preventing the Romans from bringing their superior numbers to bear. Above, the crowd grows confused. The fight has not started. Marcus stands still, a bronze statue in the center of the arena. Then, a sound from below. A scream. Not the cheer of the crowd, but a real scream of pain. All eyes turn towards the gates. From the dark mouth of the tunnel emerges Valerius, leading a phalanx of armed gladiators. Blood splatters their bodies, but it is not their own. They are no longer slaves. They are an army. The crowd's roar of excitement turns into a gasp of collective shock, then a murmur of fear. The senators in their shaded boxes rise to their feet. The Emperor Domitian stares, his face a mask of disbelief. In the center of the arena, Marcus raises his sword, not to his opponent, but to the sky. It is not a salute to the gods or the emperor. It is a declaration. He turns to the stands, to the 80,000 people who paid to see him die. And his voice, amplified by the arena's acoustics, rings out clear and strong. "Rome, your entertainment is over. Today, we fight for our lives. We fight for our freedom." A cheer erupts, but it's not from the crowd. It's from the tunnels below, as more and more slaves, emboldened by the sight, break free. The rebellion has begun. The whispers of the hypogeum have become a roar that shakes the very foundations of the Colosseum. The fight is far from over. The odds are impossible, but in this moment, bathed in the Roman sun, they are no longer just whispers in the dark. They are a storm. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this glimpse into a hidden chapter of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from the shadows of the past. The peace within the Ludus, fragile as it was about to be shattered. From the north, news of a rebellion suppressed by the empire's legions filtered down, and with it came the spoils of war, a new group of captives destined for the arena. They were a different sort from the criminals and debtors who usually filled the cells. These were rebels, warriors, people who had fought for their freedom and lost. They arrived in chains, their bodies bruised and their spirits battered, yet a fire still flickered in their eyes. The gladiators, gathered in the training yard, watched their arrival in silence. They saw the hardened men, the weary women, all bearing the marks of a failed uprising. It was a somber reminder of their own fates, a reflection of the power that held them all in its grip. Among the new arrivals, one woman stood out. Her name, they would later learn, was Kaela. She wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense. She was a healer, known in her northern homeland for her knowledge of herbs and her gentle touch. But there was nothing gentle about her now. Even shackled, her posture was ramrod straight. Her clothes were torn and her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes burned with a defiance that was almost unnerving. They scanned the faces of the gladiators, the guards, the very stones of the ludus, not with fear, but with a cold, simmering rage. The other gladiators couldn't help but notice. Drusus nudged Valerius, murmuring under his breath about the fire in the newcomer's gaze. Even Cassian, ever stoic, found his attention drawn to her. There was a strength in her that went beyond muscle and skill with a blade. The guards shoved the captives forward, their jeers and insults echoing off the walls. Kaela stumbled but caught herself, her chin held high. She was separated from the other men and women and herded toward the lowest levels of the ludus, the sections reserved for the most troublesome or the least valued. These were the damp, lightless cells where torches cast long. Dancing shadows in the air was thick with the smell of mildew and despair. The heavy iron door clanged shut behind her, the sound a final metallic note of doom. Plunged into near-total darkness, Kaela was left alone with the dripping water and the scuttling of unseen creatures. But even there, in the deepest pit of the arena's belly, her spirit refused to be extinguished. The fire in her eyes didn't die. It simply waited, banked like an ember for a chance to blaze once more. Days turned into a week. The routine of the ludus reasserted itself. The morning training, the midday meal, the afternoon sparring. The new captives were slowly integrated into the grueling regimen, their rebellious spirit gradually ground down by exhaustion and the harsh reality of their new lives. But Kaela remained in the lower cells. She was largely ignored, a forgotten piece of human collateral. Food and water were shoved through a slot in her door, but she had no contact with anyone else. The gladiators heard whispers about the defiant healer from the north, the one who refused to break. Some admired her spirit, while others scoffed, knowing that the arena broke everyone eventually. Valerius found himself thinking of her often. He remembered her fierce gaze and wondered how she was faring in the darkness. He knew that kind of isolation could drive a person mad, or worse, extinguish their will to live. One evening, after a particularly brutal training session, Valerius couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. He had earned a small measure of trust from the guards over the years, a privilege he rarely used. On a whim, he took a piece of bread from his own meager portion and a small flickering oil lamp. Under the cloak of twilight, he made his way down to the lower levels, the guards barely giving him a second glance. The air grew colder and damper with each step. He found her cell at the very end of the corridor. It was as bleak as he had imagined. He knelt by the small opening at the bottom of the door. "Hello," he called out softly, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response, only silence. He waited a moment, then tried again. "I brought you something to eat." He pushed the bread through the slot. For a long time, nothing happened. He was about to turn and leave, thinking she was either asleep or determined to ignore him. Then he saw a shadow move. A hand, thin and pale, reached out and slowly took the bread. He held the lamp closer to the opening. In the dim, wavering light, he saw her face. Her eyes, though tired, still held that same intensity. They weren't grateful, but they weren't hostile either. They were questioning, cautious. Why? Her voice was a hoarse whisper, rough from disuse. The question hung in the air between them. Why would a gladiator, one of the privileged few in this hierarchy of the damned, show kindness to a forgotten captive? Valerius didn't have a simple answer. Because no one should starve in the dark, he said, the words feeling inadequate. He didn't know it then, but this small act of compassion was a spark, lighting a fuse in the powder keg of the ludus. Kaela began to speak to him during his secret nightly visits. At first, it was just a few words. Then, stories. She told him about her home in the north, a land of green hills and ancient forests, a world away from the dust and blood of the arena. She spoke of her people, their traditions, and the rebellion born of desperation against the empire's crushing taxes and iron-fisted rule. She was not a warrior, she explained, but she had tended to the wounded, using her knowledge of plants to ease their pain and mend their broken bodies. She had been captured while trying to help a fallen fighter escape the battlefield. Her stories painted a vivid picture of the life that had been stolen from her, a life of healing and community, not of violence and chains. Valerius, in turn, found himself opening up to her, something he hadn't done with anyone since his own capture. He told her of his past, of the soldier he once was, betrayed by his own commander and sold into the life of a gladiator. He spoke of the crushing weight of his fame, the emptiness of the crowd's roar, and the ghost of the man he used to be. In the shared darkness of her cell, they were not gladiator and captive, but simply two people clinging to the vestiges of their humanity. A bond formed between them, woven from whispered words and shared secrets. For Valerius, talking to Kaela was like a drink of cool water after a lifetime of thirst. She saw past the champion, past the killer, and saw the man trapped beneath. For Kaela, Valerius was a flicker of light in her endless night, a proof that not all who wore the arena's brand had lost their souls. Their connection was a dangerous secret, a quiet rebellion against the system that owned them both. Meanwhile, Cassian was also watching. His attention, however, was not on Kaela, but on Valerius. He noticed the champion's late-night disappearances. He saw the subtle change in his friend's demeanor, new light in his eyes, a distraction during training. Cassian was a man of logic and observation. He knew that any deviation from the norm, any emotional attachment, was a weakness in the arena. And weakness got you killed. He worried for Valerius. He saw this new connection as a liability, a vulnerability that Lanista, or worse, their rivals, could exploit. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew it involved the new captive, the woman with the fiery eyes. One evening, he followed Valerius. From the shadows of the upper walkway, he watched as his friend knelt by the cell door. Lamp in hand, talking softly to the woman inside, Cassian's heart sank. He saw the intimacy of the moment, the trust Valerius was placing in this stranger. To Cassian, this was a foolish risk. He and Valerius had survived this long by relying on each other, by keeping their emotions locked away. This new woman threatened to unravel the careful balance they had maintained for years. After Valerius left, Cassian remained, his mind racing. He had to protect his friend, even from himself. The next day, he confronted Valerius in the privacy of their shared quarters. "You're getting careless," he said, his voice low and firm. "Going down to the lower cells, talking to that woman. What are you thinking?" Valerius was taken aback by the directness. "Oh, it's nothing, Cassian. She's just a prisoner." "She's a distraction," Cassian countered. "A weakness. Lanista will find out. Drusus will find out. You know what they do with weakness here? They cut it out." The tension between the two friends was a palpable thing. "I know what I'm doing," Valerius insisted, a hard edge to his own voice. "For the first time in years, I feel like more than just a piece of property. She reminds me of what it is to be human, and that feeling will get you killed." Cassian retorted. "Humanity is a luxury we can't afford. Survival is all that matters. You taught me that. The argument ended there, but the rift between them remained. Valerius was torn between his loyalty to his oldest friend and his growing connection to Kaela. Cassian, driven by a fierce protective instinct, resolved to put an end to this dangerous liaison for Valerius's own good. The dynamics within the ludus were shifting. The quiet bond in the darkness and the worried observation from the shadows were setting the stage for a conflict that would ripple through the entire gladiatorial school, threatening to bring down the fragile alliances that held their world together. The arrival of the captives, and specifically of one defiant healer, had changed everything. In the sprawling, merciless heart of the Roman Empire, where the roar of the crowd was a constant echo and the sand of the arena was perpetually stained with blood, legends were forged and broken with equal ferocity. For every hero celebrated in the sun-drenched Colosseum, 100 shadows danced in the laneways, their stories untold, their pain unseen. This is the story of one such shadow, a man who had once been the sun itself, a champion whose name was once a roar of thunder across Rome. Varo, the broken champion. His name had once been a prayer on the lips of gamblers and a curse from his rivals. Undefeated, a titan forged in the cruelest fires of the gladiatorial schools. He moved not with the brute force of lesser men, but with a deadly grace, a chilling economy of motion that turned combat into a terrifying art form. Each victory, however, only carved a deeper void within him. The cheers of the masses, the mountains of gold, the adulation of the powerful light, all became a meaningless noise, a hollow echo against the walls of his solitude. He trained now not in the sunlit yards of the ludus, but in the forgotten corners of the city, in the pre-dawn gloom where the only witness was his own lengthening shadow. The clang of his sword against a wooden post was a solitary, mournful rhythm. He had grown weary, not of the fight, but of the reason for it. He was a spectacle, a beast paraded for the entertainment of a populace that craved his blood but cared nothing for his soul. They saw the god of the arena, but not the man drowning beneath the gilded helmet. The screams of the dying, the scent of fear and sweat. The faces of men he had sent to the underworld, these were the ghosts that shared his lonely nights. He was a prisoner not of chains, but of his own legend, tired of spilling blood for a world that had offered him everything but peace. Then, one dusty afternoon in the crowded marketplace, a single moment shifted the axis of his world. Amidst the chaos of vendors and thieves, he saw her, Kaela. She wasn't a patrician draped in silk or a courtesan adorned with jewels. She was a healer's apprentice, her hands stained with herbs, her eyes holding a depth of compassion he hadn't seen since his childhood, long before Rome had claimed him. She wasn't looking at the spectacle. She was tending to a fallen child, her touch gentle, her voice a soft melody of comfort in the city's harsh symphony. Their meeting was not one of grand pronouncements or dramatic fate. It was a shared glance over a stall of pomegranates, a brief accidental brush of hands as he reached for the same fruit. But in that fleeting contact, Varo felt a jolt, a warmth that crept past the calloused shell he had built around his heart. In her eyes, he didn't see the feared gladiator, the undefeated killer. She saw him, just a man with tired eyes and a heavy soul. He found himself inventing reasons to walk through her part of the city, his silent, hulking presence a strange contrast to the vibrant life of her neighborhood. He would watch from a distance as she worked, her quiet dedication a balm to his restless spirit. She spoke of mending, of creating, of life. He knew only of breaking, of destroying, of death. They were two halves of a world torn asunder. Yet in their quiet conversations, a fragile bridge began to form. Kaela didn't ask about the scars that littered his body. She asked about the ones he didn't show. She did unflinch from the darkness in his past, but seemed to understand the weight it placed upon him. For the first time in a lifetime, Varo spoke of the boy he was before the arena of the fields he used to run through. of a life where his hands were meant for tilling soil, not wielding a sword. With her, the roar of the Colosseum faded to a distant murmur. He saw in Kaela something he hadn't dared to feel in years, a forgotten, almost alien sensation: purpose. Not the purpose of survival, not the purpose of victory, but the purpose of protecting something pure in a tainted world. His strength, for so long a tool of death and entertainment, could be something more. It could be a shield. It could be a bastion for the goodness she represented. This newfound feeling was more terrifying than any opponent he had ever faced in the arena. It was hope. And for a man who had lived so long in the dark, the light was blinding. Varo, the broken champion, had found a reason to fight again. Not for the crowd, not for the glory, but for her. And this time, he would not be fighting for his life, but for a life worth living. What happens when a man forged for death decides to fight for life? The answer would shake the very foundations of Rome. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for the next chapter in this epic tale. Varo's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the gladiator cells. Kaela's words echoed in his mind, each one a chilling premonition. A special event. A rigged spectacle. A death sentence for every new captive, served up as entertainment for the roaring crowds. He pictured them farmers, merchants, men and women who had never held a sword. Their faces pale with terror as they were herded into the arena. A wave of cold fury washed over him, extinguishing any thought of self-preservation. He could have turned away. He could have used his champion status, his hard-won privileges, to insulate himself from the coming slaughter. He could have survived. But what kind of survival would that be? Living with the ghosts of those he had abandoned, their silent screams forever haunting his nights. No, he was a gladiator, a killer, but he was not a coward. He would not stand by and watch innocent lives be snuffed out for sport. The decision settled in his soul, heavy and absolute as a block of granite. That night, as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the training yard, Varo moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He bypassed the usual haunts of gambling and drunken revelry. He sought out the corners where the true veterans resided, the ones whose eyes held the same glint of hardened steel as his own. He found Boren first, a mountain of a man from the northern tribes, sharpening a chipped axe with methodical strokes. Then came Lyra, her movements as fluid and deadly as the twin daggers she favored. One by one, he gathered them, the grizzled veterans, the silent killers, the champions of arenas past. 10 of them in total, a council of the deadliest fighters the Empire had ever known, assembled in the flickering torchlight of a secluded storeroom. The air was thick with tension and the smell of rust and old leather. These were his rivals, men and women he had fought against, bled with, and nearly killed on a dozen different occasions. Trust was a currency scarcer than freedom in this place. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, a silent assessment passing between them. Varo broke the silence, his voice low but carrying the weight of his conviction. He didn't speak of glory or honor. He spoke of the new captives, of the rigged game, of the cold-blooded massacre that the guards were planning. He laid Kaela's secret bare, a poisoned dagger dropped onto the table between them. They planned to throw them to the beasts, he said, his eyes locking with each of theirs in turn. Not for a fair fight. For a slaughter. To appease the crowds with fresh blood. A low growl rumbled in Boren's chest. Lyra's hand rested on the hilt of a dagger, her knuckles white. He saw the flicker of understanding, of shared disgust, in their eyes. They had all been new once. They all knew that terror. We could do nothing, Varo continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. We could keep our heads down, fight our matches, and live to see another sunrise. But what kind of life is that, knowing we let them die? He let the question hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. He had expected arguments, suspicion, perhaps even a blade to his throat for daring to suggest such a thing. But instead, he saw a slow change. The hardened masks of professional killers began to crack. For the first time since they had been shackled and thrown into this life, they weren't looking at each other as opponents. The rigid hierarchy of the arena, the rivalries, the blood debts, it all melted away in the heat of their shared indignation. They were no longer just gladiators. They were prisoners. They were survivors. And in that moment, they were brothers and sisters united by a common enemy. It was Lyra who spoke first, her voice a sharp counterpoint to Varo's deep rumble. "The guards are arrogant," she hissed. "They see us as animals in a cage. They won't expect us to think, to plan." Boren slammed his fist onto a wooden crate, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder. "They want a spectacle." He roared, a grim smile spreading across his face. "We'll give them one they'll never forget." A spark had been lit. Varo felt it, a current of energy arcing between them, forging a new and dangerous alliance. The conversation shifted. It was no longer about whether they should act, but how. They weren't planning a riot. That would be suicide. They were planning a rebellion, a surgical strike. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their collective knowledge of the arena complex becoming their greatest weapon. They knew the guard rotations, the hidden tunnels used by the staff, the structural weaknesses of the holding pens. Lyra knew the schedule of the Beastmasters. Boren knew which sections of the arena wall were undergoing repairs. Each piece of information was a key, a potential tool to unlock their chains. Varo listened, guided, and shaped their raw fury into a coherent strategy. They would use the guard's own event against them. They would turn the spectacle of death into a symphony of revolution. For the first time in a long, long time, Varo felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: hope. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, but as he looked at the determined faces around him, he knew it was a hope worth dying for. The stage was being set, not for a game, but for a war, and the opening act was about to begin. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for the next part of the story. Dawn broke, painting the Roman sky in hues of orange and purple. A river of people, a torrent of excitement and bloodlust, flowed into the colossal stone mouth of the Colosseum. The roar of the crowd was a living thing, a beast hungry for spectacle. Today was special. Even the emperor himself, draped in imperial purple and gold, had graced the games with his presence. He sat high in his box, a bored god surveying his mortal playthings. Down below, on the scorching sand of the arena floor, we were marched out. A procession of the damned. We were criminals, captives, and political dissidents, all condemned to die for the entertainment of Rome. The heavy iron gates slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing like a final judgment. The crowd's cheers washed over us, a wave of noise that threatened to drown our last breaths. My fellow prisoners shuffled, their faces a mixture of terror, resignation, and defiance. Most believed this was their final day, a bloody end under a merciless sun. Their eyes darted around, looking at the jeering faces. The armed guards, the sheer impossible height of the arena walls. There was no escape. But my eyes weren't on the crowd or the emperor. I looked toward the gladiator gates, the Porticus Triumphalis, where the victors would one day march. My gaze was fixed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was waiting. We were all waiting, though most of them didn't know it. Every nerve in my body was stretched taut, listening for a sound that might never come. Had our message been received? Had our allies kept their word? Doubt, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my resolve. If the signal didn't come, we were truly lost. We would be cut down, one by one. Our rebellion nothing more than a footnote in the bloody history of this place. The air grew thick with anticipation. The master of the games, a portly man with a cruel smile, was about to give the order. The first wave of gladiators, hulking figures armed with nets and tridents, were taking their positions. Their polished helmets gleamed, their muscles bunched, ready for the slaughter. I could feel the despair settling over my companions like a shroud. A young boy next to me, barely a man, began to weep silently, his shoulders shaking. I wanted to offer him a word of comfort, to tell him to hold on, but my throat was too dry. All I could do was stare at the gate and pray. Then it came, a single, clear note, a horn blast, sharp and piercing, slicing through the din of the Colosseum. It wasn't from the imperial musicians perched high above, their instruments ready for a victory fanfare. This sound was different. It was raw, urgent, and it came from below. From the labyrinth of cells and tunnels beneath the arena floor. It was the signal. A jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline shot through me. It was real. They were here. A slow smile spread across my face, a stark contrast to the terror around me. I met the eyes of a few others scattered in the crowd of prisoners, a hardened soldier from Gaul, a quiet scribe from Alexandria, a fierce huntress from Germania. In their eyes, I saw the same spark of recognition, the same savage hope. The plan was in motion. The master of the games looked confused, his brow furrowed. He glanced toward the musicians, then down toward the greats on the arena floor, a flicker of unease on his face. The crowd murmured, their bloodlust momentarily replaced by curiosity. What was this interruption? The emperor leaned forward, his bored expression replaced by a sliver of interest. They thought it was part of the show, an unexpected twist to heighten the drama. They had no idea. The horn blasted again, this time joined by another, and then another, a chorus of defiance rising from the belly of the beast. It was the sound of our revolution beginning. It was the music of our freedom. I looked at the boy who had been crying. I put a hand on his shoulder, and when he looked up, his tear-streaked face full of confusion, I gave him a grin. "It's time," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "Stay close." The guards lining the arena walls shifted, their hands tightening on their spears. They sensed something was wrong, but they couldn't pinpoint the threat. Their discipline was absolute, but today it would be their undoing. They were prepared for desperate prisoners, not an organized assault from within their own fortress. Suddenly, a section of the arena wall, one that looked as solid as any other, began to groan. Dust and mortar rained down as the stones shifted. It wasn't a gate, it was a hidden passage, a secret known only to the slaves who had built and maintained this labyrinth for generations. Our allies on the inside, with a final grinding roar, a huge chunk of the wall collapsed inward, revealing a dark tunnel and the figures of armed men and women pouring out of it. They were not gladiators. They were our people, fellow prisoners, freed slaves, sympathizers who had infiltrated the Colosseum staff. They were armed with stolen swords, kitchen cleavers, and tools turned into weapons. Chaos erupted. The crowd, which seconds before had been baying for our blood, now screamed in panic. The spectacle had turned on them. The guards, caught completely off guard, were overwhelmed. Some were cut down before they could even raise their shields. The gladiators in the arena hesitated, their professional training useless against this kind of mayhem. Were we the enemy, or were the figures pouring from the wall? This was our chance. "Now," I roared, my voice joining the cacophony. I pulled a crude, sharpened piece of rock from my tunica, pathetic weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. The prisoners around me, their fear replaced by a desperate, wild courage, surged forward. We were a disorganized mob, but we had numbers, and we had the element of surprise. We crashed into the line of startled guards, turning their own formations against them. I fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The world dissolved into a blur of motion, the clang of steel, the screams of the wounded. I saw the Gaulish soldier disarm a guard and use the manna's own spear to create a defensive circle. The Alexandrian scribe, surprisingly nimble, used his small stature to slip past defenses and strike at vulnerable points. We were no longer condemned victims. We were a fighting force. My gaze flickered up to the Emperor's box. He was on his feet, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. His Praetorian Guard, the elite of the elite, were forming a protective wall around him. Their scarlet cloaks a splash of color against the pale, terrified faces of the senators. His day of entertainment was ruined. His authority was being challenged in the very heart of his power. And I knew, with a certainty that burned in my chest, that he would make us pay. But that was a concern for later. Right now, all that mattered was this fight. This one glorious, impossible moment of freedom. The gladiators in the arena finally made their choice. Seeing the tide turning and perhaps smelling the promise of freedom themselves, some of them turned on their masters. A massive Retiarius, a net fighter, cast his weighted net not at us, but at a group of guards trying to flank our advance, entangling them for my comrades to dispatch. An enemy had become an ally. The lines between fighter and prisoner, guard and guarded, were dissolving into the red sand. We fought our way toward the newly opened passage, a gateway to the winding tunnels beneath Rome. It was our only path to escape. The battle raged, a whirlwind of violence and hope. For the first time since my capture, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting for a future that just an hour ago I didn't believe I had. The horn that had echoed from the depths was not just a signal. It was a promise that even in the darkest of places, the spark of rebellion can ignite, and that the roar of the oppressed can, for a moment, be louder than the roar of an empire. We weren't just fighting for our lives anymore. We were fighting to be heard. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next part of our tale. The story of Spartacus is a legend, but he wasn't the only one who dreamed of freedom. Countless others, whose names are lost to time, fought and died in the sands of the arena, not for the crowd's entertainment, but for a single, desperate chance to live. Today, we're telling the story of one such man, Varo, the Lion of Capua. For 5 years, Varo had known nothing but the sting of the whip, the grit of sand in his teeth, and the roar of a bloodthirsty mob. He was a champion, a survivor. His body was a tapestry of scars, each one a memory of a man he had killed. But with every victory, the hollowness inside him grew. He wasn't just fighting men in the arena. He was fighting to hold on to the man he once was, a free man with a family and a future. The whisper of rebellion started in the darkest corners of the Ludus, the Gladiator school. It was a dangerous spark in a tinderbox of sweat, blood, and despair. Many were too broken, too afraid. They saw only the futility, the certainty of a brutal death on a cross. But Varo saw something else. He saw a flicker of hope. He started to talk to the others, not with grand speeches, but with shared glances and quiet words in the dead of night. He spoke of home, of families they might one day see again. He reminded the Thracians of their mountains, the Gauls of their forests, the Numidians of their open plains. He didn't promise them victory. He promised them a chance to die as men, not as sport. The lanista, their owner, Batiatus, was a creature of greed and arrogance. He saw his gladiators as investments, not men. He grew careless, fattened by the gold his fighters earned him. He missed the way the gladiators started moving in unison, the way they'd practice fighting formations with their wooden training swords, the way their eyes held a new, dangerous light. He saw obedience, but underneath, a brotherhood of killers was being forged. The plan was simple, reckless, and born of pure desperation. During the grand games celebrating the emperor's birthday, when security would be focused on the spectacle and the crowd, they would make their move. Varo was scheduled for the main event, a one-on-one duel to the death. This would be their signal. Instead of fighting each other, they would fight their captors. Every man knew the risks. A failure meant torture and a slow, agonizing death. But the alternative was another day in chains, another fight, another step closer to a meaningless end in the sand. For them, the risk was worth it. The night before the games, a tense quiet fell over the barracks. Men sharpened whatever they could, they prayed to forgotten gods, and they looked at Varo, their unspoken leader. He met their gaze, one by one. There was no turning back now. The day of the games dawned hot and suffocating. The roar of the Colosseum was a physical force, a wave of noise that crashed over the city. Backstage, in the holding pens beneath the arena, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and hot metal. Varo stood, his heart a drum against his ribs. He looked at his brothers in arms. Drusus, the giant German who could break a man's neck with one hand. The swift Rhysarius with a trident and a net. And dozens of others all bound by the same grim fate. They exchanged nods. The moment was almost here. The trumpet blared. The massive iron gates groaned open, revealing the blinding light and deafening roar of the arena. Varo walked out into the center of the sand, his opponent opposite him. The emperor, draped in purple and gold, gave the signal. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for death. Varo raised his sword, not at his opponent, but at the emperor's box. It was a gesture of ultimate defiance. A gasp rippled through the stands. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then, all hell broke loose. The gladiator gates burst open. Varo didn't hesitate. He charged the nearest guards, his movements a blur of practiced violence. The guards, stunned by the audacity, were completely overwhelmed. Chains that once held them captive now became vicious, whistling flails. Drusus used a fallen guard's shield like a battering ram, clearing a path through the panicked soldiers. The carefully orchestrated spectacle of the games devolved into a whirlwind of genuine, chaotic battle. The pristine sand was churned into a red-brown mud. The air filled with the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, and the furious shouts of the emperor, demanding more legions to quell the uprising. For a glorious, fleeting moment, it felt like they had won. They fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. They were a storm of vengeance sweeping through the Colosseum's corridors. They broke through the first line of defense, then the second. The path to the city streets, to freedom, was opening up before them. The crowd, moments ago, baying for their blood, was now a panicked mob, scrambling to escape the violence they had paid to see. The irony was lost on no one. But the Roman Empire was a machine built on order and brutality, and it did not tolerate chaos. Alarms echoed through the city. From the barracks, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite soldiers, began to mobilize. They were fresh, heavily armored, and disciplined. They formed impenetrable walls of shields and spears, blocking the exits. Varo and his men, armed with mismatched weapons and wearing little armor, crashed against this disciplined line like a wave against a cliff. The initial momentum of their surprise attack began to wane. The fighting was desperate and brutal. For every legionary they cut down, 2 more seemed to take his place. Drusus fell, a half-dozen spears in his chest, still roaring defiance with his last breath. Chorus was cornered, his net tangled, and was cut down from all sides. Varo fought like a cornered lion, his sword a silver blur. He saw the faces of his falling friends, their hopes for freedom extinguished in an instant. The dream was dying. The weight of their sacrifice, the futility of their struggle, crashed down on him. But he did not stop. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him surrender. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the arena, Varo stood alone, surrounded by a mountain of bodies, both friend and foe. He was wounded, exhausted, his sword arm heavy as lead. He faced the commander of the guard, a cold-eyed man whose face showed no emotion. There were no more shouts, no more roars. Only the quiet, grim finality of defeat. Varo looked up one last time, not at the emperor, but at the sky, at the first stars beginning to appear. A final, defiant breath. He charged. Varo's rebellion failed. He and all who fought with him were killed. Their bodies were made an example of, a stark warning to any other slave who dared to dream of freedom. In the grand narrative of Rome, their uprising was a mere footnote, a minor disruption quickly and efficiently crushed. But stories have a way of surviving, whispered from one slave to another, passed down in secret. The story of Varo, the man who chose to die on his feet rather than live on his knees, became a legend. It was a story not of victory, but of courage. A reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the spirit can refuse to be broken. That a single act of defiance can echo through eternity. A testament to the undying hope for freedom. Thank you for watching. The names and specific events in this story are fictional, but they represent the very real struggles of countless individuals throughout history. If you found this story powerful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the past. We'll see you next time. Friends, picture this: the heart of the Colosseum. The air thick with the roar of the crowd and the smell of blood and sand. The rebels, led by the fierce Kaela and the noble Varo, have just fought their way to what they believe is the brink of victory. They've defeated gladiators, outsmarted the arena's deadly traps, and now they stand before the emperor's box, their moment of triumph at hand. The crowd is in a frenzy, a mix of shock, awe, and a strange, budding respect for these underdogs who dared to challenge the might of Rome. Kaela, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her sword dripping, points it directly at the emperor. The silence that falls is absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. For a heartbeat, it seems like the impossible has happened. They've won. But this is Rome, a city built on power and strategy, and the emperor is its master architect. Just as Kaela is about to speak, to declare their freedom, a low, ominous, grinding sound echoes through the arena. It's not the sound of a gate lifting for more beasts, but something far more sinister. The emperor, who had appeared cornered and afraid, now has a chillingly calm smile playing on his lips. He hasn't been trapped at all. He's been the one holding the strings of the trap this entire time. The crowd murmurs, a wave of confusion and dawning horror rippling through the stands. Varo, ever the strategist, senses it first. His eyes dart around, not at the emperor, but at the walls of the Colosseum itself. He knows this isn't over. Suddenly, hidden panels in the arena walls, camouflaged to look like solid stone, slide open. From these dark openings, a new wave of soldiers pours onto the sand. But these are not ordinary legionaries. They move with a discipline and precision that is terrifying to behold. Clad in ornate dark armor, brandishing tower shields and gleaming short swords. They are the emperor's personal elite, the Praetorian Guard, the best of the best, loyal only to the emperor himself. They don't charge wildly. They advance in a perfect, implacable formation, their shields locking together to form an impenetrable wall of steel. The rebels, exhausted and wounded from their previous battles, are now completely surrounded. The escape routes are cut off. The vast arena has transformed from their stage of victory into their tomb. The mood shifts instantly from triumph to desperation. The rebels, who just moments ago felt the surge of invincibility, now see the cold, hard reality of their situation. They are a handful of weary fighters against hundreds of the Empire's finest, freshest troops. The Praetorians close in, their steps synchronized, a rhythmic, deadly drumbeat on the sand. The rebels instinctively form a tight circle, back to back, their weapons raised. Hope is a flickering candle in a hurricane, but the fire of defiance still burns in their eyes. Kaela shouts orders, her voice raw but unbroken, trying to organize a defense against an indefensible position. She knows this is a battle they cannot win, but surrendering is not in their nature. The clash is brutal and swift. The Praetorians are a machine of war, their attacks coordinated and ruthless. The rebels fight with the fury of cornered animals, every swing of their swords a desperate attempt to carve out another second of life. But for every Praetorian they manage to strike down, 2 more take his place. The fight becomes a maelstrom of steel and blood. In the chaos, Varo never leaves Kaela's side. He is her shadow, her shield. He sees a Praetorian lunge at her from her blind spot and throws himself in the way, his own body absorbing the vicious stab of the sword. He grunts in pain, but shoves the soldier back, his gaze never wavering from protecting her. He parries another blow meant for her, the impact jarring his arm, but he stands firm, a bastion of loyalty. The Emperor watches from his balcony, his expression unreadable, almost bored. Like a man watching a play he's seen 100 times before. This was his final act, a demonstration of his absolute power. He wanted to give the rebels hope, to let them touch the sky, only to personally cast them back down into the abyss. It wasn't just about killing them, it was about crushing their spirit, and the spirit of anyone else who might dare to dream of rebellion. He wanted to show all of Rome that defiance is not only futile, it is a path to a carefully orchestrated, public, and humiliating demise. The roars of the crowd have died down, replaced by a stunned, fearful silence as they witness the Emperor's cruel genius. As their numbers dwindle, as their strength fails, a profound understanding passes between the remaining rebels. They look at each other, their faces streaked with grime and blood, and they know the end is here. There will be no escape, no victory, no tomorrow. But in that shared glance, there is no fear. There is no regret. They had a choice, to live on their knees as slaves or to die on their feet as free men and women. They chose the latter. With a final unified war cry, they launch one last desperate charge, not to win, but to meet their fate head-on. They refuse to be herded and executed. They will not kneel. They choose to die in the heat of battle, their weapons in hand, their dignity intact. They chose strength over fear. A final, powerful act of defiance in the face of overwhelming power. Their legend would not be one of victory, but of courage. By sunset, the rebellion was crushed. The roar of the crowd had faded, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy over the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. The great Gladiator revolt, a desperate bid for freedom, had ended in defeat. But as the last embers of the fight died out, something else was kindled in the hearts of those who watched. The story of their bravery began to spread, not in official records or triumphant marches, but in hushed whispers. It was a story told by merchants in the bustling forums. Their voices low as they recounted the sight of Varo, the champion, leading his brothers against impossible odds. It was a story shared by slaves in the shadowed kitchens and sprawling villas, a tale of hope that flickered in the darkness of their servitude. They spoke of Kaela, the fierce warrior woman, whose spear danced like a deadly flame, and of the unity of men and women from different lands, fighting for a single cause: freedom. Even among the ruling class, in their opulent homes, the story was told, but with a different tone, one of fear. Fear that the spirit of this rebellion was not truly extinguished. That very night, as Roman soldiers cleaned the arena and tallied the dead, a small group of survivors slipped through the city's gates. Led by a wounded but unbroken Kaela, they were ghosts melting into the darkness of the surrounding hills. They carried with them no treasures, no spoils of war. Only the searing memory of their fallen comrades and the heavy weight of their failed uprising. They were few, a mere handful against the might of Rome, but they were the living embodiment of the rebellion's spirit. They vanished, becoming phantoms in the countryside, a constant unseen threat to the empire's rigid order. Back in Rome, the legend of Varo's final stand grew with every telling. It was said he fought like a god unleashed, that he took down 10 legionaries before a dozen spears finally brought him to his knees. They said, even as he fell, his eyes burned with defiance, a look that would haunt the dreams of the praetor who gave the final order. His sacrifice was not a pointless death. It was a seed. a seed of defiance planted in the fertile ground of Roman oppression. In the years that followed, the empire tried to erase their memory. They forbade the mention of Varo's name, tore down any makeshift memorials, and punished anyone caught speaking of the revolt. But you cannot kill an idea with a sword. The story of the Gladiator rebellion became a symbol. It was a spark, crossed the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. From the sun-scorched fields of Egypt to the misty forests of Gaul, other uprisings began to ignite. A group of miners in Hispania, inspired by the gladiators' courage, threw down their tools and fought their overseers. A legion of auxiliaries on the German frontier, hearing the tale from a traveling merchant, mutinied against their cruel centurion. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, was a ripple from the stone Varo had cast into the pond of Roman society. The gladiators had lost the battle, but their legacy had started a war of ideas. They had shown the world that even the most oppressed, the most disposable people in the empire could rise up. They proved that the chains of slavery were only as strong as the will of those who wore them. The great Colosseum, that monument to Roman power and cruelty, had been intended to display the empire's absolute control. But on that day, it became the stage for something else entirely. It became a crucible where courage was tested and a legend was forged. The gladiators taught Rome a lesson it would never forget, that the human spirit, when pushed to its limit, will always fight for the light. Because sometimes, even in the darkest arena, in the heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, courage can burn brighter and last longer than any chains. Their bodies may have been broken, but their story became eternal, a testament to the enduring power of hope. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the heart of ancient Rome. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. See you next time.